It's my pleasure to introduce our first featured speaker today. Congressman Keith Ellison is among the best equipped individuals in Congress to lead on the question and the answer of human rights and how do we support human rights in Iran. Congressman Ellison has dedicated his career to advancing civil rights here at home, and as a member of Congress has led on this issue of universal rights abroad. He's spoken with credibility and consistency on this issue. In 2009, Congressman Ellison introduced the Stand With the Iranian People Act. This was just months after the June elections in Iran and the aftermath and the turmoil that we saw. He introduced legislation that would actually impose for the first time human rights restrictions on abusers in Iran's government. And we now see that those sanctions have come to fruition. The legislation also lifted restrictions that inhibited U.S., or it would have lifted it, restrictions that prevented U.S. NGOs working on human rights, working on humanitarian services, from working directly with the Iranian people. It also targeted companies that support repression in Iran by providing surveillance technology and other repressive technology. Now serving in his third term, Congressman Ellison represents the 5th District of Minnesota. He is now the co-chairman of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. He continues to be an outspoken advocate for civil rights here at home and human rights abroad. He continues to walk the walk and talk the talk. And we're very pleased to have him today. So please give us a warm welcome for Congressman Keith Ellison.
Thank you, Jamal, and pleased to be to everybody here. Good morning. Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoy visiting with you here at NIAC, and as often as you're having this conferences, I'll be here if you all invite me. So thank you all for having me here just another time. Let me also acknowledge that I really appreciate the opportunity to work with members of NIAC who were a essentially indispensable resource in my effort to introduce and draft the Stand With the Iranian People Act of 2009. In particular, my friend Trita Parsi, Dr. Parsi, has been an indispensable partner, and I want to thank him in particular for all his work, but he doesn't do it alone, and I want to thank everybody who's with the organization. It's also a privilege to be here with the Ambassador and Assistant Secretary. I'm glad we could come together for this event, and I commend each of you for your remarks. Also, let me thank everyone who participated on that previous panel. It was an outstanding one, and I think that the thinking that's going on the panel needs to be replicated on multiple fronts. In fact, I think given the changes that we have seen in the Middle East over the last several weeks now, this is an extremely opportune time to really try to reconceive of the United States relationship to the Middle East and even the rest of the world. The United States has done a lot of good things in the world. There's no doubt about that. I'm proud of that. We're one of the largest donor nations in the world, and I'm proud of that. But it's also true that our relationship to the Middle East in particular has been somewhat limited to a few factors. Oil, our historic relationship with Israel, and counterterrorism has been basically the 3 prongs of our relationship with the Middle East. I submit we need to broaden the relationship significantly, and that human rights needs to be an essential factor in that relationship. Because it's the right thing to do, yes, it certainly is the right thing to do. We who pride ourselves and hold our values of due process, of freedom of expression, we hold these values. We, I think, who've secured these blessings of liberty have a duty to stand for them for the whole world. And if we don't, it looks like we don't really mean it. I think it's time to really declare that, you know, our belief in civil and human rights for people to declare their own form of government, to have governments that are responsive to the needs of the people, shouldn't just stop at the water's edge. Now, of course, we shouldn't impose these values on anybody, but we certainly shouldn't stand silent while the values that we cherish the most are being denied to people around the globe. And I want to thank you for being here, because your very presence and participating in this conference is a sign and a signal that you are for that new relationship. But this new relationship has got to be built by people writing, by people speaking, and by people advocating for a new policy that should be marked by diplomacy, development, and other instruments of how nations interact. But the consistent stream, I think, should be that human rights stream. And I think that that's something that we should string together and make sure our relationship is based on advocating, signaling our support for human rights around the world. And I think that the rubber really hits the road when these things cost us, right? When we're in a relationship with a government that somehow meets some of our economic and strategic needs, but at the same time, they're human rights violators. It's easy to take a blind eye and not look in that direction. But I think this is one of those times where we really need to say, you know what, these things are not the only considerations, and human rights needs to be one, because I think fundamentally, human rights do lend for long-term overall stability in a nation, where people can raise their own voices, can speak their own truth without fear of being carted off and being on the business end of a jail cell or worse. I believe those societies will be more stable over time. Those societies will be the ones where, yes, sometimes we'll have policies that will align. Sometimes we will disagree. But in the long term, we will be in a position where we can always talk and work out the problems that are facing both peoples. I think that this policy of just backing the strong one who's maybe occupying leadership in a given country is a policy ultimately that will lead to massive instability. And I think Iran is a case example of this. You know, for so many years, the relationship was not based on mutual interest and mutual respect. You all know the history. And in 1953, the democratic initiative of the Iranian people was undermined. And so for so many years, we followed that policy because it met our own economic and strategic interests. That policy changed radically in 1979, and we've been dealing with the aftermath ever since that time. So think about if we had a human rights approach from the early days. Think about if that was the way we characterized our relationship. We would be in a very different place. We wouldn't be in a very difficult place we're in now. This is a tough spot that we're in, quite frankly. We have sanctioned Iran so much, we have almost no levers to play on them. Now we're at the point of sanctioning our economic partners who will impose sanctions on them. A very not exactly direct relationship. And of course, when we see human rights abuses going on in Iran, which are tragic, which are horrible, which violate our basic sense of what's right and wrong, which harm the human spirit, and yet people keep on emerging no matter what happens. We have almost put ourselves on the sidelines with regard to influencing Iran because of policies that we've pursued over the last 30 plus years. And so I think it is time to say, look, we do believe in human rights, we do mean it, we're willing to put some skin in the game to prove that, and I hope that that is the direction that we go in. And I think we've begun to really head that way. I think President Obama has done some important things to move the policy in that direction. It's been, but of course, given all the complexities, things have been slow. But as Americans living in the United States, we can form the basis of a peace constituency that says human rights has got to be the way we interact with the rest of the world. And so I do urge you, as people who've been leaders in this area, to keep the work up and to write more, to do more, to have more meetings like this one, to break up out of the Beltway, to talk to people all over the United States about how a consistent ethic of human rights is not only the right thing to do, but will lead to long-term stability, which will benefit us in all manner of ways, whether academically, economically, strategically, diplomatically, from a development standpoint. This, I think, has got to be the way we move forward. None of those are my prepared remarks. That's actually what I was just thinking. So let me go to my prepared remarks now. When I spoke at last year's NIAC conference, I said that the most important role of Congress vis-a-vis Iran is to do no harm. Given the recent direction of Congress, that bears repeating. We're hearing more hardline rhetoric, more criticism of diplomacy, and we must not revert to a generally antagonistic approach with Iran, which has produced little progress. President Obama has done a good job painting a broad line between the Iranian people and the Iranian government. And we cannot give the Iranian people the impression that we are categorically anti-Iranian because we sometimes condemn the actions of their government. Again, we cannot revert to the old axis of evil mentality of the Bush years. We have to be careful and smart. Operating by that standard, I authored legislation in 2009 to support the Iranian people and tie the hands of those in the government who abuse them. My Stand with the Iranian People Act did three things. One, applied targeted sanctions to human rights abusers and the government. Two, prohibited companies from selling surveillance and censorship equipment to Iran. Three, lifted the ban on U.S. NGOs in Iran so they could provide critical services to the Iranian people. And let me tell you, this third prong is no small prong. I can tell you that there are NGOs that are formed and organized by Iranian Americans trying to help young people who definitely incur some significant burdens as they try to deliver services, whether they be medical attention or whatever they are. It's never easy, nowhere nearly as easy as it could or should be. And I think we need to understand the importance of allowing a child to travel from Iran to the United States to get a medical procedure that will change that child's life that we take for granted here in the United States. Not only does that change that child's life, but it creates a very, very positive impression about what the American people are all about. So we need to untangle the knots that make it so difficult to do that. I was happy to see that the SMART sanctions President Obama signed into law last year contained some of the provisions of the legislation that I introduced. But to call it my legislation really wouldn't be fair. The legislation was basically, NIAC was an indispensable resource, as I mentioned already. It's really our legislation. As we move forward, we must continue to make human rights the centerpiece of our foreign policy towards Iran. By aligning ourselves with human rights, we'll highlight the distance between the Iranian people and their government and put pressure for reform. Let me talk about human rights in Iran, as if you all don't know all about it. If we don't speak up about human rights violations in Iran, our silence will allow the Iranian government to continue beating, jailing, killing, and executing the brave souls fighting for democracy. Our silence won't send the following message to the our silence would send the following message to the Iranian people, that we're only concerned about our own business, not about you. That can never be the message that we send. We have to send a consistent message of concern and a consistent message of support for the democratic impulse. Inaction is action, and it will be read as action, read as silent consent. If we don't rally the international community to focus on human rights violations, the Iranian government will strengthen its grip, as it is trying to do in the recent weeks. If I look now to the recent changes in the Middle East and Egypt, Al Jazeera's cameras filmed Tahrir Square constantly, capturing police brutality and Mubarak's thugs thrashing peaceful protesters. The world was watching, and the government felt that pressure, as was evidenced by Vice President Suleiman's denunciation of Al Jazeera, which he said was fueling sedition. With the world's attention on Egypt, the government's options were constrained. In Libya, we saw a much different picture. In that situation, we hardly saw any pictures at all in the first days of the protests, which were largely peaceful. Gaddafi was able to crack down brutally, in part because of the absence of foreign media. And as you know, a similarly dire situation has been played out in Iran in recent weeks, where the government is able to operate with near impunity in the absence of foreign media. So in the absence of this so-called Arab Spring, the Iranian government has chosen to clamp down instead of opening up. As our friend Kareem Sajapur of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace put it succinctly, the title of his op-ed in the New York Times recently, he wrote, "The Arabs arise, Tehran trembles." But the ban on foreign media is now more important than ever, and we have to keep up the pressure. Finally, the international community needs to remind the Iranian government that we are watching, and we need to remind them, one, that we know that the country's two main opposition leaders, that we know when the two main countries' opposition leaders go missing. I add my voice to those demanding immediate release to Mir Hussein Moseveni and Mahdi Karudi. And we also need to remind the Iranian government that people have a fundamental right to peaceably assemble. I especially want to applaud the brave men and women who took to the streets last week to commemorate the 100th anniversary of International Women's Day. I want to point out that in addition to Mousavi and Karoubi, their wives have been detained too. By continuing to speak out about human rights violations, we'll send the right message to the government, which is stop, and the people, we are with you. We must remain vigilant in our efforts, and I want to thank you all for listening. So that's it.
So the Congressman is available for about 5-10 minutes of Q&A. So for those of you that have questions, please identify who you are and your organization. And we have microphones going around in the back there. So questions?
Hi, I'm Hossein Shabazi with Webster University. Congressman, just before your arrival, perhaps you were here too, the panel, before you talk about the double standards of U.S. policy towards countries of the region, specifically two items were brought up. One was the Israel-Palestinian issue, and the other one was just the recent apparent consent of U.S. towards Saudi's action in Bahrain. I'd like to get your opinion, and also since that your view perhaps would be counted more here because of your affiliation with the Democratic Party. Thank you.
Well, obviously they're double standards. I don't really think it can seriously be denied. I mean, people will try to, but they're there, and we all see it. I think the real challenge is how do we align our values with our rhetoric. And that's a challenge, because as I pointed out in my extemporaneous comments, there is a status quo. And the status quo is basically held up by economic and strategic interests that are long-standing. I mentioned that we have basically a three-pronged relationship. And again, I think that it's legitimate for the United States to have interests and legitimate for it to pursue them, but I also think that human rights is an interest of ours too, and we can't dispense that for the other ones. So I think that the work of us as Americans, I know there are many Iranian Americans in the room today, the work for us as Americans is to help our country live up to the true meaning of its creed. We've done it in the past, and we can do it now. This is a commitment I call everyone to. It's not enough to stand back and point out the double standard. It's like pointing out this lectern. It's here. What our job is to close the gap between what we say and what we do. Now, how do we do that? We can't do it by ignoring the fact that there is a status quo. And the status quo is U.S. energy needs, oil and natural gas, historic alliance with Israel, which is not going anywhere. That relationship is going to be where it is. But I say the United States, sure that we have one ally, we can have more than one. What's wrong with that? Let's add, not subtract. And the third one is counterterrorism, which of course is everybody's interest is in making sure that we live in a society that's safe. But let's deepen and broaden and strengthen the relationship. Let's on academic exchange, media, artistic exchange. Let's improve our economic exchange. Let's do these things. I really believe that there is room for sanctions. I've actually introduced sanctions bills myself. But the greater history of sanctions is that it doesn't do much to change the conduct of the country and when the sanctions are targeted. Usually when we do sanctions, if there's a good reason to do sanctions, it is like in the Egyptian situation. You and I as Americans do not want any Egyptian who is fighting for civil and human rights to have to pick up a tear gas canister that says made in America. If that government's going to oppress those people, they won't do it without participation. That's a good reason for sanctions. Not that if we would have not sent anything over to Egypt, that it would have stopped Mubarak, but we don't want to participate in it. That's a reason for sanctions. But to think that sanctions are going to, you know, change the script, usually they don't. So I don't know. So I don't have an answer for how to close the gap on the double standard, but I believe that we do. So let's get about it. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Maria Posey with the UN Information Center, and in the previous panel, they were pretty adamant about engagement needs to come from an international coordinated effort, and that the U.S. has very little capability to do more to change. And I'd like your view on that as well. Do you support
I think that I pretty much said that already, that based on not talking and engaging in 15 years of sanctions, 30 years of not talking, our ability to change events in Iran is severely limited. You all heard me say that, right? He heard me say it. Thank you for nodding, sir. And so, yeah, I think that we need to work internationally. There's no doubt about it. And I think that the rest of the world. Plus, you know, I think that the days of, you know, go it alone U.S. policy should kind of come to an end anyway. I think we should, the times in every nation's history when it should act on its own because it has to, but our default position should be multilateralism, and so yeah, I definitely agree with that. Yes, sir. No, that's you.
The argument for reopening a U.S. interest section in Iran, based upon the fact that in terms of reciprocity there is an Iranian interest section here, sounds like a very legit argument to me. I was just wondering if, do people in the government share the opinion? Are there people interested in it? Why?
Well, let me say this. Whenever you talk about the government in the U.S., there's different parts of it, right? There's the legislative branch, there's the administration, there's the judiciary. I work in the legislative branch, and the only people, I don't have a boss other than the people who elected me to come to Congress, so I can say whatever I want. The good thing is that I'm free to say what I want to say, and the bad thing is I'm one of 435 House members and 535 House and Senate members, and me by myself not being a committee chair, you know, it's not that easy for me to just do what I want to do. You understand? So don't take what I'm saying as, well, let me just say this, what I'm saying, don't interpret that as the U.S. government position, because it's not. It's my position, okay? Absolutely, we should put up an interest section there. Now let me just tell you why. You don't know about that. Good to see you. Let me tell you why we should do that. Absolutely, we should do it, and here's why. We're not gift. When we put up an embassy on the interest section in another country, it's not a gift to them. Do you understand what I'm saying? And we're not doing something for the other country by having someone to look after our interests there. And by withdrawing it, it's not a punishment. I'm quite certain that the people who are ruling the government in Iran are just fine with the U.S. not having anybody on the ground there. They're like, good, go. I think we should have an interest section or an embassy everywhere we can, without regard to whether we like that government or not. Because even if we don't like them, even if we have a lot of serious problems with them, we need somebody who go to them and say, we have serious problems with you. See what I'm saying? And so I'm one of those people who would definitely believe that we should do that. I thought it, you know, I'm glad that we're trying, about the new relationship we're trying to establish with Syria. And I talk to Syrian Americans who tell me a lot of problems, but they also point out you're not hurting anybody by not having somebody, an ambassador there. You might as well have one. And you notice a lot of countries who we have, where they have ambassadors or interest sections in our country, where we don't have them there, you know, they want to be represented here. They want to tell us what their views are, how they feel about things, even if we don't agree. And I definitely believe that if you want to make sure that a problem never gets solved, the first thing to do is to not talk about it.